Hello and welcome to Unworthy History. Today we got some actual history for you from this book right here, Border Wars of Texas by James T. Deshields. This book was published all the way back in 1912. Now the story that we're going to read about today took place in 1823. It's about the early battles between the settlers of Stephen F. Austin's colony and the Karankawa Indians. During the spring of 1823, a severe drought prevailed, and but a scant crop of corn was made that season in the colony. In the summer, 3 young men were ascending the Colorado River with a canoe load of corn, which they had raised on the cane lands below the settlements. Near the mouth of Skull Creek, a few miles from the present town of Columbus, in Colorado County, they were waylaid and fired upon by the Indians, Loy and Alley being killed. John C. Clark, however, with 7 severe wounds, swam to the opposite shore and by secreting himself in a dense thicket, escaped, and recovered to live many years and accumulate immense wealth. He died in 1861. Later the same day, and near the same place, Robert Brotherton, a young man recently from St. Louis County, Missouri, unexpectedly rode among the same party of Indians, thinking they were friendly Tonkawas. Losing his gun in the struggle to free himself, he put spurs to his horse and escaped with a painful arrow wound in the back. Reaching the settlement, Brotherton gave the alarm. When this news was received, says Kuykendall, about a dozen of the settlers led by my uncle, Robert Kuykendall, went in pursuit of the Indians. The Tonkawas were at that time camped near his house, and the settlers thought it prudent to take their chief, Karita, with them to ensure good behavior of his people during the absence of the party, whose families would be unprotected until their return. Upon arriving near the mouth of Skull Creek, the party halted in order to spy out the Indians, and some time after dark they heard them in a thicket pounding briar roots. Locating the enemy, the settlers dismounted, secured their horses, and awaited the coming day. By the morning twilight they were enabled to find a small path which led into the thicket and to the camp of the Indians, and as silently as possible, says one of the party, we crawled into a thicket about 10 steps behind the camp, placing ourselves about 4 or 5 steps apart in a sort of semicircle, and completely cutting off their retreat from the swamps. As the first Indian arose, the signal for action was given. The surprise was complete. The settlers rushed on the camp and delivered a deadly fire. 9 or 10 warriors were killed on the spot. 10 more were slain in their wild attempt to retreat. 2 escaped badly wounded. The encampment was destroyed, and the settlers returned home without further incident. This was a severe blow to the Karankawas, and it caused them to leave the settlement for a time and to use more stealth and precaution in their depredations. During the fall and winter of 1823 and 1824, Austin's colony was in a very feeble condition. The impresario Austin, recounting the trials and privations of his colonists at this early period, says, "They were totally destitute of bread and salt. Coffee, sugar, etc. were remembered and hoped for at some future day. There was no other dependence for subsistence but the wild game, such as buffalo, bear, deer, turkeys, and wild horses, mustangs. The Indians rendered it quite dangerous ranging the country for buffalo. Bear were very poor and scarce, owing to failure in mast, and poor venison, it is well known, as the least nutritious of all the meat kinds. The Mustang horses, however, were fat and very abundant, and it is estimated that at least 100 of these were eaten during the first 2 years. The Karankawa Indians were very hostile on the coast. The Wacos and Tawakanese were equally so in the interior and committed constant depredations. Parties of Tonkawas, Lipans, Beatties, and others were intermingled with the settlers. They were beggarly and insolent, and were only restrained the first 2 years by presents, forbearance, and policy. There was not force enough to awe them. One imprudent step with these Indians would have destroyed the settlement, and the settlers deserve as much for their forbearance during the years 1822 and 1823 as for their fortitude. In 1824, the strength of the settlement justified a change of policy, and a party of Tonkawas were tried and whipped in the presence of their chiefs for horse stealing. Thus, the impresario Austin himself has given us a brief but vivid picture of what must have been the difficulties, privations, and dangers which had to be borne and overcome during the first years of his colony. Austin himself was absent from his colony for several months, being very unexpectedly called to the city of Mexico to secure ratification of his colonization contract by the new revolutionarily formed government. The Indians were more or less troublesome and threatening. Provisions were scarce, store-bought clothing was an almost unknown luxury, and many privations as well as real sufferings were experienced. To give the reader a better knowledge of the deplorable conditions and gloomy prospects existing in the infant colony at that period, we extract briefly from letters and narratives of some of the early settlers. Colorado River, December 1st, 1823. Dear friend, since I last wrote, our sufferings have been very great for want of provisions. On account of dry weather, our crops were very poor, and are now entirely spent. The game has left this section of the country, and we are now very much pressed for food. There have been a great many new settlers come on this fall, and those who have not been accustomed to hunting in the woods for support are obliged to suffer. Were it not for a few boys who have no families, their wives and children would suffer much more than they do now. In fact, I fear some of them would starve. Those of us who have no families of our own reside with some of the families of the settlement. We remain here notwithstanding the scarcity of provisions to assist in protecting the settlement. We are obliged to go out in the morning, a party of us, to hunt food, leaving a part of the men at home to guard the settlement from Indians, who are very hostile to us. Indeed, we dare not go out and hunt except in companies, as we are obliged to keep on a lookout, lest the Indians fall upon us, and one cannot hunt and watch too. Game is now so scarce that we often hunt all day for a deer or a turkey, and return at night empty-handed. It would make your heart sick to see the poor little half-naked children, who have nothing to eat during the day, watch for the return of the hunters at night. As soon as they catch the first glimpse of us, they eagerly run to meet us and learn if we have been successful in our hunts. If the hunters return with a deer or turkey, the children are almost wild with delight. While on the other hand they suddenly stop in their course, their countenances fall, the deep bitter tears well up in their eyes and roll down their pale cheeks. 'Tis truly heart-rending to see us return home after a hard day's hunt without any game, knowing, as we do, that the women and children are entirely without food, and can have nothing until we find it in our hunts. No one can know our sufferings or even imagine our feelings unless they have been in similar situations, and to render our situation the more dreadful, our sufferings the more acute, we are often obliged to get the women of the different settlements together and make a kind of fort to protect them from the merciless Indians. It is surprising to see how bravely the delicate females bear up under their sufferings without a murmur or complaint. 'Tis only by their looks they show their feelings. When we seem the least discouraged, they cheer us with kind words and looks, and strive to appear cheerful and happy. They do more when we are worried out with toil and fatigue. They take our guns in their hands and assist us in standing guard. Our prospects for the winter look very gloomy. If the Indians attack us, I scarcely know what we shall do, but I hope for the best and trust that we shall be provided for in some way. Were it not for the Tonkawa Indians, a small tribe who are friendly to us and supply us with dressed deerskins, we should be almost entirely destitute of clothing. Once in a great while we were able to maintain a small piece of unbleached domestic, or a bit of calico at the exorbitant price of 75 cents a yard, with someone passing through the country, but this is very seldom. The common dress of men and children is made of buckskin, and even the women are forced to wear the same. Your affectionate friend, W.B. DeWeese. Captain Jesse Burnham, in his reminiscences, after telling of his enfeebled condition from sickness, and that we got out of bread and had no food for 2 days, says, "At last I heard one of my children say, 'I am so hungry.' I was too feeble to hunt, but I got up and began to fix my gun slowly. I didn't feel as though I could walk, but I started on my first hunt. I had not gone far when I saw 2 deer, a fawn and its mother. I shot the fawn first, knowing the doe would not run far. Then I shot and killed her. "Oh ho," I said, "2 deer in one day and my first hunt." I took the fawn to camp to my hungry children, and took William, my oldest boy, and a horse after the doe. Horatio Chrisman, the famous surveyor and early Indian fighter of Austin's colony, says, "All these emigrants suffered for want of provisions. We had about 8 acres of corn, which if not worked immediately was certain to be lost. I could not stop the plow to hunt. I took no sustenance save a few stinted drinks of buttermilk, until after I finished plowing over the 8 acres. My plow animal was an old, slow, blind mule." A few weeks afterward, Mr. Chrisman learned that James Whitesides, whose residence was on the east side of the Brazos, had gone to the United States on business, and that his family, consisting of his wife and 2 little boys, had little or nothing to eat but lettuce. Sending out his excellent hunter, Martin Varner, he secured a very large buck, which he threw across his horse and carried to Mrs. Whitesides, a distance of 20 miles. Aunt Betsy, says Chrisman, never forgot this favor. The lot of these first pioneers was indeed a hard and rugged one, but in common, and they were ever ready to assist and protect each other at their own discomfort, and often at the risk of their lives. So that's it for this episode. So this occurred back in 1823 and 1824, and we heard about some of the rugged times for Stephen F. Austin's colony during that period, and also their battles with the Karankawas, which seemed to move the Karankawas or sort of lessen their depredations on the colony during that time. So if you want to hear more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe. And we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.